Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where we're very pleased to have on the show our United States Senator David Vitter. David's going to talk to us about the big issues that are facing our federal government, our nation as a whole. He's going to talk about the economy, debt, and he's also going to talk about the fact that we have a lot of tensions overseas in the Middle East, a lot of war going on. So join us on the next Legal Lines with our United States Senator David Vitter. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. We're very pleased to have on the show today our United States Senator David Vitter. David.
Hey, Locke. Great to be with you.
Good to see you again.
Thank you for the invitation to come back.
Well, a lot of stuff is going on.
Yeah.
And I wanted just to have a chance for you to explain to the folks kind of where we are in 3 or 4 major areas.
Sure.
Before we dive into that, just educate them real fast on what your background is and your education.
Yeah, I grew up in Louisiana. I've always lived here all my life except for college, and grew up in the greater New Orleans area. Then went away to college at Harvard University undergrad, then went further away. I was very blessed to win a Rhodes Scholarship and studied at Oxford in England for 2 years, which was a wonderful experience in all sorts of ways, including outside the classroom. And then I came full circle, came back home and got a law degree at Tulane.
And David, it's important to point out, you never say it, but you had many awards and accolades during that period of time.
I worked hard, and that was recognized, which is nice. I usually don't bring that up because I want to preserve a political career here in Louisiana. I don't want to ruin anything. But I thought from high school on about wanting to come back and live here. I love Louisiana, and I often thought, we have so many enormous strengths: natural resources, culture, history, and most of all, our people. Wonderful people with great personality and attitude and great strengths. And to me, as I grew up here, the thing that was really holding us back was our political culture. Mm-hmm. A culture in the past really rooted too often in corruption and cronyism, and I wanted to be some small part of changing that.
And so you've been, frankly, a huge part of changing that, both here in the state level and at the federal level.
Well, the good news is I really think we've turned a corner as a state, getting away from the negative aspects of that political tradition of culture and cronyism, really building a new tradition, a reform tradition built around conservative reform values that match Louisiana. So I'm excited about that.
David, and we've discussed this in the past, but you are uniquely qualified in that some of your studies were in economics.
Yeah, I studied a lot of history and a lot of economics, and both of those I think have served me well. Certainly these economic issues always come up, particularly now that we're in a horrible economy, trying to get out of the remainder of this recession, trying to grow jobs in the economy.
And let's kind of talk about that.
Sure.
Let's educate the folks on what the economy is. I mean, let's just define that for them. Yeah. What is the economy?
Well, it's all goods and services, exchange, buying and selling, everything we're involved in on the commerce side. And again, right now we have an enormous challenge trying to come out of what has been the worst recession since the Great Depression. Now, economists will say we're no longer in a recession.
Right.
But it still
sure doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, it still feels like a recession. It's a very slow, very sluggish economy. And a lot of folks, including economists, say instead of what's a normal V-shaped curve, you go down into recession, you turn the corner, you come back up. We seem to be stuck in more of an L shape. We went down for sure.
Right.
And hopefully we've hit bottom. Hopefully we're not going to go down further.
But there's a little bit of fear
there. But we seem to be coming across and not really going up in a substantial way.
Dr. Lauren Scott said the exact same thing last month.
Yeah. Some other folks call it a jobless recovery. We're out of the recession technically, But where's the job creation? Job growth is still very, very sluggish, and that's what impacts families' daily lives.
David, when they say we're out of the recession, what's their definition or criteria to make that determination? And who says that?
Yeah, there are formal economic rules and guides about what that means, and it has to do with GDP growth. But again, sometimes you can have that growth and still have a jobless recovery, or even if you meet that metric with regard to gross domestic product, the jobs lag. And so that's where the rubber hits the road. That's what really impacts people's lives and families. It is jobs, job growth. That's still very sluggish. We've seen a little bit of growth. Unemployment nationally has come down recently to 8.3%, but over 8% is still horrendous. And when you consider the number of folks not looking at all, another whole category, the number of folks who are underemployed, working some but not nearly what they want to work, it's still a very, very soft economy.
Well, and I've been reading that when you, if you quit looking for work after a month, you're no longer counted.
No, you're not counted
and
at
so
all.
When we say the unemployment rate has dropped down to 8.3, that's based on the number of folks they say who are still looking for a job.
Right.
And it excludes the folks who have quit looking for a job only after a month. Correct. And like you said, those who are not fully employed, they're underemployed.
Correct.
If you include those folks, the rate's what, about 15%?
Oh, I've even heard 17%, particularly in a very bad recession and in a long recession like this. A lot of folks quit looking actively. They're very discouraged, and so that figure grows even more.
So kind of to summarize, I think what you've said, in my mind, basically the economy is a technical word for employers using employees to produce services and goods.
Absolutely.
And you need sellers of those goods and services, and you need buyers.
Right.
And our buyers come from where?
Well, our buyers are, first of all, at home, all of us as consumers. That's the most important base. And then, of course, some industries, we export product to other consumers around the world. We don't do nearly as much of that as we'd like to. We have a balance of payments problem, although it's been getting a little better recently. But so our buyers are both at home and abroad, anybody who consumes, who buys our goods and services.
And so if, for example, you got folks here in Louisiana who don't have a job, they're not going to be buying a whole lot.
That's right.
And if you've got other countries who are in a recession or whose finances are collapsing like they're talking about occurring in the European Union, you got no buyers, or your number of buyers are going down.
That's right. And this has been a major worldwide recession that we're trying to get out of, and that has impacted us a lot. Then in addition, there are troubles brewing elsewhere, Greece and Spain and Portugal, about the size of their debt. And of course, we have a debt problem too, and that also is a threat to us.
So what is the government's role, but local, state, and on the federal level, but let's talk about the federal level, in dealing with the economy and helping create an environment for jobs?
It's one of those fundamental things that I think most Republicans and conservatives have a certain view of, and most national Democrats and liberals have a different view of. On the left, a lot of folks would say the government's role is to hire people, is to invest in certain industries, is to get very directly involved in a lot of this economic activity. As a conservative, I would say something different. The government's role is to create a climate and create policy that encourages private sector growth, job creation, expansion. I would always focus on the private sector as the real engine of our American economy, and the government's role is to create the right policy to allow the private sector to grow and to thrive.
And so I guess based on the fact that for several years the Democrats were in control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they implemented their policies over the last several years, and it doesn't seem to have helped. Let's discuss that on the next segment.
Sure.
This is Locke Meredith on Legal Lines with our United States Senator David Vitter. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, very pleased to have on the show today our United States Senator David Vitter. David, let's dive back into it.
Absolutely.
We were talking about what is the government's role in helping the economy, which is basically helping employees hire employees.
Right.
So tell me the difference between the liberal or Democratic view versus a conservative / maybe Republican view.
Well, nationally and in Washington, I think liberals want the government to be very directly involved in hiring, in owning some parts of industry, in investing, in bailing out big players in the economy, including banks, in directly hiring people. Conservatives, on the other hand, want government to set the right policy that encourages private sector growth and vitality. And I think that's a main, pretty fundamental difference. Now, that difference, I think, has never been more stark than in the debate over the last few years, particularly coming out of the financial crisis. 2008, it's beyond dispute, we had a major financial crisis in late 2008, and that led to the bailouts and some of that unprecedented U.S. federal government role in the economy. I was very concerned about those proposals from the beginning. I voted against all of the bailouts because I feared that over the long term we were going to increase permanently, not temporarily, permanently increase the federal government's role and dominance over the economy. I think, unfortunately, that's proven right, at least so far, because you had that crisis, and then right at the same time, Barack Obama was elected president. And he really used the opportunity to dramatically increase the role and scope of the federal government with bailouts, with major spending programs, with dramatic increases.
Purchases of private businesses, in fact.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking of the auto industry.
Yeah. And so I think you really have had a shift in terms of the dominance of the federal government in the private marketplace.
Now, I've heard, and it's the facts, that the bottom line is this occurred while President Bush was there, and they're saying, hey, the reason we collapsed was because you Republicans were in charge and y'all created this environment. What is your response to that?
Well, if you look at the financial crisis, there were a lot of causes, but some of the causes were on the government side, and it wasn't conservative policy, quite frankly.
So what was it?
It was a lot of policy built up over years that demanded, for instance, that in the home mortgage business, that everybody deserved a home and deserved home ownership and a mortgage no matter their ability to pay. That instituted a lot of political tests for that rather than market tests, and that led over time to unsound loans.
Bottom line is banks, if I'm hearing you right, banks were pretty much forced or coerced by the federal government to make loans to folks who normally wouldn't qualify?
Yeah, in many cases that's right. The two biggest areas of that policy are something that's been around for years called the Community Reinvestment Act, where banks are essentially graded and forced to make certain transactions they wouldn't otherwise make. And secondly, the dramatic growth of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are essentially big institutions for home mortgages that were backed implicitly, but now almost explicitly by the federal taxpayer.
Almost like I think of it as an insurance company in essence, that if these loans go bad, we're going to make you whole. We're going to pay for it.
Yeah, and the federal
Meaning
taxpayer.
Us, the taxpayer.
Yeah, the taxpayer was the one on the hook behind that. So on the government side, I think those were some of the big forces that led to that 2008 crisis. Then on the private side, there were other things that clearly got out of hand and mushroomed.
I have read, David, recently that with the bailout funds that were spent to deal with the housing market, the federal government could have bought 10 million homes.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money.
It's incredible.
It's a huge amount of money. And again, my concern from the beginning was this huge growth of the dominance and power of the federal government directly in the private economy.
I guess what's frustrating me is I'm going, we spent enough money, the federal government, our tax dollars, to buy 10 million homes, and we still have the worst housing crisis. Nothing's changed. It hasn't improved. There are 1 million foreclosures on the books.
And part of the reason is if you look at President Obama's response and how a lot of that money has been spent, it's just been growing government, everything in sight. You know, the stimulus plan was his first big push upon coming into office. That was a $1 trillion bill. When you count the interest to borrow that money, because it was all borrowed money, it was over $1 trillion. Now, it's hard to wrap your head around what that means, but I'll give you one small example. If somebody in the day of Jesus Christ had started spending $1 million a day, $1 million a day from Christ's time, we wouldn't be up to that amount of money yet.
$1 trillion.
It's a lot of money.
Holy
and again, it wasn't focused on specific needs, specific priorities, specific programs. It was really used, in my opinion, to grow government, the federal government, everything in sight. And so it just boosted the federal budget and almost every federal program in sight. Because of that, what happened is what I feared. I voted against the stimulus plan because I knew it would make one dramatic change. Deficit and debt would go through the roof, which it did, $1 trillion overnight. But in terms of job creation, it did very little for that. President promised it would keep unemployment below 8%. Unemployment then was below 8%. He said it would get us back down to that level, and of course it still hasn't done that for a long time. We were hovering near 10%.
I've actually read that the average of the economy that the federal government generates was about 20%, 18%.
Yeah.
It's now 25 or 26%.
Yeah. That's a major growth in just a few years. And I think we need to be very concerned that that's going to be a permanent shift and not a temporary response to a crisis.
You mentioned the debt. Let's kind of try and tackle that, because we hear the terms the national debt and the deficit. Yeah. Distinguish or explain the difference between the deficit and the debt.
Yeah. Well, the deficit is 1 year. It's how much we're borrowing in this single year at the federal level to cover what revenues do not cover.
So what is it? What are the numbers this year?
Well, it's over $1 trillion. That's several times years in a row. It's been over $1 trillion. We broke that line a few years ago, and now we've done that year after year after year. So that's the deficit, 1 year. The debt is that accumulating over time. So obviously, if you have a deficit of over $1 trillion several years in a row, you're putting $1 trillion on top of $1 trillion on top of another trillion. Our debt is now well over $15 trillion.
And approaching 16 at the end of this year, right?
Approaching 16, and over the next 10 years, if we stay on the unsustainable fiscal path we're on, we'll add another $9 trillion in 10 years. So it's really a completely unsustainable path.
So to summarize the deficit, let's say the government says we're going to spend $3.5 trillion this year. They only receive tax revenues of $2 trillion. So they have to go borrow the other 1.5 trillion.
The remainder is borrowed money.
And where are we getting that?
Deficit. We get it from anybody who buys U.S. Treasury bills, basically, which is a form of a loan. Now, that's a lot of American citizens, great. It's also a lot of folks outside this country, including the Chinese. They own a huge amount of our debt. So we're beholden to them because they're like the bank, and we owe them money. Let's
continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith, Legal Lines. Our United States Senator David Vitter. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, so pleased to have on the show our United States Senator David Vitter. David,
thank you again, Locke, for the invitation.
Thanks so much for coming in.
I really appreciate it.
Let's continue this, and I know it's kind of technical and complicated, but it's really important.
Okay.
So what are the consequences of our federal government having to borrow every year over $1 trillion to the point now that we're approaching 16 trillion in debt?
Well, it's just like a family or a small business in some sense. If you have that level of debt, after a while it's unsustainable. First of all, it grows and grows and grows, and it just becomes unsustainable. Right now, our debt is as big as our whole economy for a year, our GDP.
It's never happened like that, right?
Well, it's happened once before for a pretty good reason. It happened in World War II.
That's right.
When we had to build a modern army overnight to defeat Hitler. Now, if you're going to go into debt, that's a pretty good reason you have to do it. Because we didn't have a modern army. We literally had to build that overnight to defeat Hitler. We had to borrow a lot of money to do it, and then we paid it back in the 50s with a very healthy economy. But now we have a level of debt comparable to that. We're not in the middle of World War II. We have our challenges, including internationally, but we don't have that level of challenge. And so this amount of debt is just huge.
And of course, the Democrat folks would say, well, we are at war, and that's the reason we have this level of debt. What is the response to that?
Well, that's part of the reason, and we are at war, and it's a serious challenge. I don't think it's comparable to building a modern army overnight to defeat Hitler, so I don't think it's that level of historical reason. The biggest reason, and this pre-existed the war on terror, the biggest reason is Washington has just lost all fiscal discipline. People say yes and yes and yes to every interest group in sight, every spending program in sight, with no way to pay for it.
And I've read, and you're in the Senate has not given a budget.
Correct.
Since President Obama was elected.
Yes. The Senate has not even tried, majority leader, the Democratic majority has not even tried to pass a budget in 2.5 years. They're not even trying. Now again, at home that doesn't work. You don't just forego even having a budget plan. If you run a Louisiana small business, that doesn't work. You have to start with a realistic budget plan. In the Senate, Harry Reid and the Democratic majority have just thrown up their hands, aren't even trying.
So our government is borrowing 40 cents or 45 cents of every dollar they spend, and that translates, I have read, into every single United States citizen, a baby born today to the 99-year-old person, of $46,000 to $50,000 per person.
Yes. Just a few years ago, it was about 28. That was really high. But it has almost doubled in just a few years. This problem has exploded. Absolutely exploded.
It's going to consume our nation if we don't do something.
Yeah, just a few years ago, this was a problem, but we would talk about the burden we were leaving to our grandkids. It's not a grandkids issue anymore. It's an us issue. This threatens to be an immediate crisis. I don't know when. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know when it will lead to that sort of crisis atmosphere, but that will happen given the path we're on. It's not a question of if, it is a question of when. And we just have to look to Europe to see that crisis.
They're collapsing over there because they were basically what's called an entitlement society. Born till your death, we're going to provide benefits to you. So, huge problem, $50,000, $60,000 to every single U.S. citizen. What do we do to fix this?
Well, real broadly speaking, we need to do two things at the same time. We need real cuts, real fiscal discipline.
So what have they been talking about, David? They come out and say, we've cut it.
They've been talking about Washington cuts. And a Washington cut is you have spending growing at 9% a year and you cut it to 8%.
So they're cutting the growth of expenditure.
Yeah, that's not a real world cut. That is a Washington cut. We need real cuts, and at the same time, we need real, robust economic growth. You can't just cut your way out of it because the hole is too deep if we have a bad economy. And you can't just grow your way out of it if you continue this spending pattern as we have over the last several years in particular. We need both at the same time.
So where would you say cuts need to happen immediately?
Well, everything needs to be on the table. For instance, I'm a big defense hawk, and I certainly favor a strong military.
But that's a big hit, right?
Yeah, but that's a big part of the budget. and that needs to be on the table. There is real fraud and waste and abuse at the Pentagon. We need to root that out. I don't think we should just chop things across the board and hurt a lot of muscle and bone as well as fat, but we need to surgically go in and go after that waste. That can be real dollars at the Pentagon and elsewhere. Ultimately, the biggest piece of the pie is what's usually called mandatory spending or so-called entitlement programs. Big programs including Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. That's a big, big part of the budget. So we need to reform the system, not just to cut and save money, but to save those programs. Because if those programs aren't reformed, they won't be around for the next generation.
David, if I recall, there was this super committee that was going to come up with recommendations, or actually a very powerful committee, and they didn't make it happen. And as a result, automatic cuts are set to take effect 50-50 between those entitlement programs and the military.
Correct.
Now that occurs at the end of this year, or when?
2013. That occurs in 2013. I didn't vote for that bill establishing the super committee because, number one, I thought the upfront cuts were almost non-existent, and number two, I had concerns about the super committee process. One of those concerns, unfortunately, is coming to pass. The automatic cuts that are slated to happen in 2013 because the super committee didn't act, as you said, are half military and half non-military. Well, again, there is fat at the Pentagon, and everything needs to be on the table. But the Pentagon defense is 17% of the budget. They're getting 50% of the cuts, and I think that's out of kilter.
And of course, we're in two wars right now, and we got Iran over there rattling their saber as loud as it can possibly be rattled, and threatening shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, and we'll dive into that later. But what do we do? I mean, it seems like a pretty bad time to be cutting the military.
Again, we need to get out of these automatic cuts, particularly when defense is 17% of the budget, gets 50% of the cuts, and do the real and the hard work ourselves.
David,
Congress.
Realistically, this being the election year, come November of 12, is anything going to happen?
Well, the conventional wisdom is certainly no, and that's really a shame. For two reasons. Number one, this is a ticking time bomb, and nobody knows when it's going to go off, and there's no guarantee that it can wait until next year. Number two, the other thing that's a shame about it is, while most folks think of divided government as being at complete loggerheads, everything gets stuck in the mud, it's also actually a unique opportunity to do some big things, to have the political atmosphere and the political cover, if you will, because everybody's part of the solution to do some big things on mandatory spending, on tax reform.
Excellent.
Things like that.
We'll continue this on the next show. We'll be right back on the next show. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. Our United States Senator, David Vitter, thank you for being with us. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where we're very pleased to have on the show our United States Senator, David Vitter. David's going to talk to us about the big issues that are facing our federal government, our nation as a whole. He's going to talk about the economy, debt, and he's also going to talk about the fact that we have a lot of tensions overseas in the Middle East, a lot of war going on. So join us on the next Legal Lines with our United States Senator, David Vitter. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. Welcome to Legal Lines. We're very pleased to have on the show again our United States Senator, David Vitter. David, let's dive right back into it.
Absolutely.
We were talking about the fact that we have to reduce the spending from the federal government. Right now, it's set, given some legislation that took place, that 50% of the cuts come from the military and 50% from the social programs. Explain how you think that should occur.
Well, first of all, we need to do more than those minimal cuts. But secondly, I'm concerned about that having a real adverse impact on national security. The Defense Department is 17% of the budget. It'll get 50% of this next round of cuts.
Way disproportionate.
Basically because Congress hasn't done its job. Congress hasn't gone in and done the tough work and made specific decisions in specific spending programs. So we need Congress to get in and do its job and not just throw up its hands and say we'll have these across the board cuts.
And basically you're saying because we have a federal government right now that's divided, the power's divided between Democrats and Republicans, really the tough issues could be tackled because frankly both parties would be blamed for it.
Yeah, most folks understandably think of divided government as complete gridlock. And obviously that's true a lot of times, and it's probably, unfortunately, going to be true this year. But divided government is also an opportunity for people to come together and do some important things that aren't always easy. You think back in history, it was Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill.
I remember.
Who used divided government to save Social Security for a whole nother generation and extend out the life and solvency of Social Security.
And that's where we are again.
Yeah.
We need to fix it or it's gone.
It was divided government under Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress who balanced the budget for several years, who came together on welfare reform. Bill Clinton vetoed it twice, but then he passed it.
He heard from the people.
Right. And so divided government did those big things. We need to do that again, particularly with big challenges like saving Social Security and Medicare. It's not just a question of cutting them, it's saving them.
Right.
Are we going to save them or not?
Meaning if we don't fix it, they're going to collapse.
Yeah. Also on the tax side, we need dramatic fundamental tax reform. Simplify the tax code, make it fair, do away with all the special interest loopholes and credits and deductions, and use that to lower rates on individuals and on business to make American business more competitive.
On the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid programs, I know we've got folks who get very terrified when they hear that there may be cuts, but I think they don't understand that we're talking about minor adjustments that enable those programs to stay in place. Explain to them.
Well, I think the first two things we need to say is it's not just a question of cutting these programs. The goal is not to cut. The desire is to save these programs. The question is, are these programs going to be here in the near future? And if we stay on the path we're on, they will not. So it's a matter of saving the programs. Secondly, I think we need to reassure current retirees and folks who are about to retire, say 55 and older, that we're going to hold them harmless. They have planned on the current rules for a long time, and it's not fair to change those rules when they have planned on those rules for their entire working lifetime. We're going to hold them harmless. But for younger workers, we can transition into some new rules over time. And if you make some gradual changes to retirement age over time, to things like that over time, means testing for Social Security. I don't think if you're making $1 million a year, you don't need Social Security.
That's right.
If you do that over time, those can make a huge difference and still not hurt, not threaten any current retirees or any folks who are about to retire.
David, I remember reading that when Obamacare was voted on and passed, that it included, as I recall, $500 billion cut from Social Security programs.
From Medicare. You're thinking of Medicare. Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of my top reasons for opposing Obamacare. You had Medicare, the medical program for seniors, 65 and older. It's already on a pretty short path to being done away with because the numbers aren't there, the money isn't there, and Obamacare stole $500 billion away from that already failing program to set up a brand new program. That was just wrong. We need to be doing the opposite over time and saving and bolstering up both Medicare and Social Security for current seniors and the next generation.
I know that the way the Democrats and the Republicans approach taxes is completely different. President Obama is talking about raising taxes to address the debt of the nation, and Republicans don't want to do that. Explain to the folks why Republicans do not want to raise taxes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, as a conservative, I want there to be new revenue to help solve the deficit and debt situation, and that needs to be part of the solution. The question is, how are we going to get that revenue? I want it from a growing economy. I want it from tax reform that adds on to jobs, adds on to economic growth, and revenue grows with that. A lot of liberals, like the president, want it from just simply jacking up tax rates, increasing tax rates on a lot of folks. And my concern with that is that that often chokes off economic growth. As we try to come out of this horrible recession, that's going to make it even more difficult.
And my recall is that the proposal by President Obama is to raise taxes on the, quote, wealthy, which has been defined as any individual who earns more than 200 grand or a married couple 250.
Right.
And so he's going to raise taxes on those and I guess keep them the existing tax rate that President Bush put in place. Why is that ineffective?
Well, first of all, that's the promise. If you look at the Obama record, it's quite different. If you look at Obamacare, for instance, there are significant tax increases, fee increases, cost increases that affect a lot of people below that income level. So the promise is one thing, the reality and the record is something else, and I'm very concerned about impact on middle-class taxpayers. Secondly, even if that promise is kept, while it may not affect tax rates for middle-income people, it can certainly affect employment and the economy.
Right, because that's really why we're talking about all this stuff.
And what folks want more than anything is a job and security about their job. So even if they're held harmless in terms of tax increases, that's going to be a little consolation if they don't have a job,
right,
if they lose a job, if they don't have a job and it's tougher to get one. So what we really need to make sure is that job growth is healthy.
And so the Republican argument that I've heard is that, look, if you raise taxes on the folks that we've just indicated would have them raised on, they're not going to have money to invest in businesses and products to create jobs.
Absolutely. Perfect reason is that a lot of small businesses are organized in such a way that the owners of that business pay through the personal income tax rate. They're not corporations. They're set up so it's a flow through and the taxation is through personal rates. Well, a lot of those small businesses, truly small businesses, backbone of our economy here in Louisiana, elsewhere, get bumped up to the top rate. And
right,
so that tax increase is on them. Now, to hear President Obama and liberals in Washington talk, these are all gazillionaires sipping pina coladas on a beach somewhere.
Just not the case.
That's not the case. There are a lot of small businesses that would be impacted.
All right, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. Our United States Senator David Vitter. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, we're very pleased to have on the show today our United States Senator, David Vitter. David,
thanks again, Locke. Appreciate being here.
Thank you. We were talking about, to summarize real quickly, that we have this huge debt. We've got to reduce spending in the military and in the entitlement programs. And we've also got to deal with revenue coming into the federal government via taxes, but in a very logical way.
Yeah, and revenue growth has to be part of the solution. We need more revenue. The real disagreement is, how do we get it? I want to get it by growing the economy, by having a fairer, simpler tax code, which will add on jobs, promote economic growth. Liberals want to get it by just jacking up rates, which I think would do the opposite in terms of making it tougher for the private sector to grow those jobs.
And the reason is, at least in my thinking, is that there's not a whole lot of things that I can look at that the federal government has done efficiently and very effectively compared to the private economy. So if you leave the money with the private economy, that money is going to go to the place where it is most needed, and it's going to do it the most efficiently because people want to make money.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there are some things only the federal government can do.
Sure. Military.
National defense is the obvious example. Another good example is the federal highway system and interstate system. Private industry alone, on its own, isn't going to build that. There's a necessary role for the federal government. But beyond that necessary role, the more the federal government does, I think the more it hampers, in a lot of ways, private industry job growth, and it's a very inefficient way to grow the economy.
Let's talk about, when you talk about growing the economy and how that in and of itself will generate more revenues for the federal government. I kind of think of it as, people think we've got this pie, it's only this big and it's not going to get any bigger. So if you're getting a slice of the pie that's, say, 20%, it is what it is. And there's no chance to grow the pie. But if the pie becomes this big, you're getting a big piece of it.
Different policy out of Washington can dramatically impact whether that pie is stagnant or even shrinking or whether it's growing. And right now we have way too small a pie considering the size and potential of our nation. We need to grow that pie much more effectively, and that will, of course, grow revenue with it.
All right, and you've talked about a fair tax or a flat tax or a way of dealing with the tax code better. I know I'm not using the proper terms. Explain that in a little more detail.
Well, actually, one hopeful sign is over the last few years there's been a lot of bipartisan consensus forming over this. And the idea is to dramatically simplify the tax code.
Meaning what?
Every American nods at that, meaning get rid of almost all of the special interest deals and specific exemptions and deductions and specific provisions of the tax code. Get rid of that and use that to lower rates. So you lower overall rates for individuals as well as businesses, but there aren't these special deals and special exemptions. You could do that in a way that raises the same amount of money in day one, but it would really encourage economic growth, and it would spur economic growth so that over time it raises a lot more money and you have increased revenue.
Well, let's talk about another component that inhibits or reduces the ability to grow the pie. We talked about tax policy. Let's talk about regulations.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's killing business from everything I read.
Absolutely. Now, once again, there's some base level of regulation I support, virtually everybody supports.
Sure.
Basic health and safety and environmental regulation. Nobody's talking about getting rid of that. What I'm talking about is getting rid of this recent avalanche of over-regulation that's occurred over time, but particularly under President Obama. A perfect example of that is his EPA, particularly as it intersects with our Louisiana energy industry.
Right.
There's just been an avalanche of regulation way beyond what's needed to protect important health and safety, which all of us support. And it's been depressing the energy industry and making it tougher and tougher to grow jobs in that vital sector.
And that's bringing to my mind this whole Keystone pipeline issue. Explain to the folks what that is and what happened.
Well, the Keystone XL pipeline is a proposal that's been on the books for years, waiting for a permit from the Obama administration.
I've read 3 years, right?
Yeah, they've been studying it for 3 years. This is a big pipeline proposed from the middle of Canada down through the heartland of our country to refineries in Texas on the Gulf Coast. It's the biggest shovel-ready project around. Of course, that term has gotten a bad name recently because of the Obama stimulus, but it's a true shovel-ready program. It would be 20,000 jobs.
In America?
In America. It would be $7 billion of investment.
And that's coming from private sources. That's not the federal government
private.
using our tax dollars.
Not taxpayer dollars. That's private investment. And it would be 700,000 barrels of oil a day from Canada, one of our closest allies.
Nobody that hates us in Canada the way we got over in the Middle East.
So it's a win-win-win. Unfortunately, I think it's pure politics that have gotten in the way. President Obama is beholden to the far left environmental movement, and he's vetoed it, at least for now, with his reelection in sight because of that politics. And I really think it's just politics over people, and that's a shame.
Let's talk about, because you've had a proposal called the 3D program that deals with a way to create a lot of energy for us, a lot of jobs for us, a lot of tax revenue for us. Explain to the folks what it is.
Yeah, 3D stands for domestic jobs, domestic energy, and deficit reduction. And we can achieve all of those really important goals by increasing our domestic energy sector. That's a big part of our economy that we have artificially hindered from Washington.
Because of regulations.
Because of regulation, because of putting stuff off limits. You know, like a lot of Americans don't know this or don't think of ourselves this way, but we're the single most energy-rich country in the world, bar none.
It's
bar
amazing.
None. We're way richer than
oil,
Saudi
gas,
Arabia.
everything.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia or any Middle Eastern country. We're the single most energy-rich country. The problem is we're the only country in the world that takes 95% of what we have and puts it off limits. Says you can't drill off the East Coast, can't do anything off the West Coast, can't touch the Eastern Gulf for now, can't touch most of offshore Alaska, can't do anything ANWR. And increasingly, this Obama administration is making it tougher and tougher to access these very rich shale finds in the western states and other parts of the nation, including northwest Louisiana. And so we're taking 95% of those resources, that richness, and putting it off limits. If we simply reverse that policy, access that energy in a clean, careful, responsible way, which we can do, we would grow jobs, we would grow domestic energy, energy independence, and that would produce a lot of revenue to lower deficit and debt. At the federal level, that's second only as a revenue source, second only to the U.S. income tax. So after the income tax, the next source of revenue in terms of dollars is royalties, revenue off domestic energy production.
Proven historically. And I remember reading last year that President Obama was given $1 billion, I believe, to Brazil so they can develop their oil and gas industry so we can buy it from them instead of us doing it. I don't understand.
Yeah, to me as a Louisianan in particular, it was galling when he went to Brazil and made speeches about wanting to support their industry. What about our industry starting in the Gulf of Mexico?
I just don't understand it. Well, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith, Legal Lines. Our United States Senator David Vitter. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, we're extremely proud to have on the show today our United States Senator David Vitter. David, again, thanks.
Thanks, Locke.
All right, we were talking about the energy component of our economy and how if we could access it and go after it, we would be able to generate a ton of jobs, a lot of revenue, and we
energy independence,
wouldn't be hurting the way we are.
It's a threefer. I mean, you think about all of our big debates as a nation, and this is a partial solution. It's not everything, but it's a major part of the solution to our biggest problems. Energy independence. We all want to be less dependent on volatile parts of the world like the Middle East, folks who don't much like us. We want to get away from that dependence. Jobs. Our top priority right now, trying to come out of this recession, is jobs. And those are great jobs. And jobs, by the way, which by definition, you can't outsource. You have a domestic energy job, you're not sending it to India.
That's right.
You're not sending it to other parts of the world. It has to stay here. And finally, deficit and debt reduction, which is a huge challenge. And again, revenue on domestic energy production is the second biggest source of revenue of the federal government, second only to the U.S. income tax.
David, I want folks to know too that you have been fighting hard to get the Gulf opened back up so that we can get back to where we were. It's been a long struggle. There was a moratorium and then permits weren't being issued and then it was real slow. Where are we in that?
Well, we're making a little headway, but it's still a struggle, and of course all of this is coming out of the BP disaster.
I remember you putting holds on his secretary.
Yeah. Now look, everybody agrees that coming out of the BP disaster, we needed to figure out what went wrong. We needed to make certain changes to make sure that never happened again. We needed to take a good, hard look at our regulation, which I think we've done. But after we do that, now that we've done that, we need to move on. We need to get back to producing good American energy out of the Gulf of Mexico. We're still not doing that to the extent we were pre-BP.
I've read we're down by a third.
Yeah, exactly. Permitting is 30 to 40% below what it was before BP. Now, President Obama likes to brag, and he said it again in the State of the Union, that we're producing more energy domestically than ever. Well, that's true because of permitting of his predecessors, because of what previous administrations did. Obviously, a permit takes a long time to come online and actually produce energy. But his permitting is still 30 or 40% below pre-BP levels. We need to get it back to that level and then grow from there and open up access to other domestic energy.
Let's talk about the national security component to this, because you said it earlier, we're sending billions and billions and billions of dollars every year to Middle East countries, some of whom are openly hostile to America.
Yeah. Our military men and women are all over the Middle East. Now, I'm not one of those folks who says that's just because of oil, but clearly that region is more important to us because of the oil than it otherwise would be.
We sent a carrier over there to deal with the Strait of Hormuz because Iran's saying we're going to shut it down.
Absolutely. And every day we send boatloads of money off our shore to buy energy. That's very negative economically and in every other way. We should do everything we can to lessen that, and we have the resources here at home to make a major dent in that. Just the Keystone XL pipeline, which is from Canada, so it's not quite U.S. energy, but it's pretty darn close. That's 700,000 barrels of oil a day. That just coincidentally is about the same amount of oil as we get from Hugo Chavez. We could cut that off.
He hates our guts.
Yeah, we could cut that off if we had the Keystone. We could dramatically decrease the amount of oil we get from Saudi Arabia or other Middle Eastern countries if we had the Keystone. If we opened up domestic energy sources in a much wholesale way, we could make a lot of inroads in that direction.
Let's talk about the Middle East and the wars that we have in Afghanistan and Iraq and the other, Iran doing what they're doing, threatening to just destroy Israel. What are your views on what's happening to our military? I'm reading we're going to reduce the force by 100,000, reduce the revenues by $1 trillion. I don't understand.
Well, Locke, as I said on an earlier program, look, there's fat and waste and abuse everywhere, and everything needs to be on the table in terms of cutting spending and lessening deficit and debt, and that needs to include defense and the Pentagon. But we don't want to cut through fat into muscle and hit bone and really suffer from a national security point of view. I think we did that under President Clinton with the so-called peace dividend. Remember the peace dividend, the Cold War was over, so I think we overreacted and cut a lot, and lo and behold, we had other threats, and that led to 9/11. And so we realized the hard way that there were a completely new generation of threats that were very real, in some ways even more dangerous. So we don't want to make that mistake again. We need to be careful about it.
David, what are your thoughts on the fact that just Iran threatening to cut the Strait of Hormuz drives the oil prices up? I mean, if oil prices, as I understand it, go up significantly, it can literally decimate our economy. We would be thrown back.
Yeah, overall,
decades.
I think the single biggest threat we face right now is from Iran. And Iran getting the nuclear bomb, which they're on the path to do, would make that threat 1,000 times more dangerous. Not simply because they would use it on us the next day. I don't know that would ever happen. But first of all, it would empower them, make them much more significant in the Middle East. Secondly, it would immediately lead to a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. If Iran gets the bomb 8 other Middle Eastern countries will get the bomb shortly thereafter.
A tinderbox.
And that, right, in the most volatile part of the world. And third, whether the Iranian government ever uses nuclear weapons, they have all sorts of ties to terrorist networks. And they would make that technology accessible by terrorists and never have their fingerprints on it. And that, I think, would be the greatest direct danger to both Israel and the United States.
In fact, I was reading that their top religious leader has basically sent out word, anyone who harms the nation of Israel or the United States, we will support you.
Yes.
These are folks that, at least my understanding is, they want to, at least some of them, die killing as many Jewish folks or Americans as they can.
Yeah.
How do you deal with something like that?
Well, the first step, I think, is to recognize the threat and to take it seriously.
We were talking about it. It's almost like we're back in the 30s with Hitler.
To me, this is eerily similar to the 30s and Hitler. And Hitler was very explicit about his aims. He wrote a whole book about it. He put it in print. And yet, even after he did that, a lot of folks in the West, in the United States, said, oh, disregard that. That's just politics. That's just German politics. That's just his playing up to a certain element of his society. Well, obviously, history proved that talk as foolish. And we should have taken him at his word from the very beginning. I feel exactly the same way about Iran. They are very explicitly threatening the actual extinction of Israel, threatening direct attacks on the United States. And I think we need to take them at their word, particularly as they're on the verge of becoming a nuclear power.
David, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Locke, very much. I really enjoyed it.
This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines, and our guest, our United States Senator David Vitter. Thanks for being with us.